today I'm going to be going over the first test review, and so let's turn to that. You need to know, first of all, how Descartes' ideas influenced those of Peter Unger. Now, the good thing about this course, one of the good things about it is that a lot of the material for the review will be given to you in written form, and you'll also be getting these lectures on video, so you'll have both. Okay, so let's talk about how Descartes' ideas influenced those of Unger. Unger got from Descartes the idea of a possibly undetectable deceiver who could manipulate people's ideas and consciousness so that people may think that something is real when it isn't. Think of the Matrix movies, right? In the Matrix movies, you had a situation in which people's perceptions were, in a sense, counterfeited or falsified. They were experiencing the world through a computer program, and what they thought was real wasn't, and yet it seemed quite real to them. Well, Descartes, who, by the way, lived a long time ago, obviously, but Descartes, centuries ago, wanted to find a firm foundation for progress in philosophy and in science. Now, Descartes was a great mathematician, and he was great at geometry. But let's put it this way: Descartes wanted to find a firm foundation for knowledge, again, for scientific and philosophical knowledge, and he thought the way to do this would be to find grounds for doubting things that most people excuse me, take for granted. And that includes beliefs based on the five senses. Okay, so Descartes said, how do I know at any given time that I'm not having an extremely vivid dream? Now, that argument, by the way, the argument from dreaming, was used thousands of years ago by Plato to cast doubt on the reliability of the senses. For Plato was a rationalist. Of course, so was Descartes. In other words, these were people who had more esteem for reason than for sense experience, and maintained that we need to use our reason to determine the extent to which we can ever rely on sense experience. But in any event, so Descartes got this idea from other philosophers, and including Plato, that how do we know at any given time we're not dreaming? That, by the way, that argument, that skeptical argument, was, again, not original with Descartes. It was used at least as far back as Plato. But what was possibly original with Descartes was this argument from this evil genius, a possibly supernatural person with, in effect, unlimited power to deceive and the power to manipulate consciousness. Okay? And so that is something that may well be original with Descartes. And so Descartes said, how do I know that my experience is matching the world? I mean, how do I know that that my experience is accurate? When I think that there's an oven in front of me and I'm putting wood in it and it's burning, how do I know that that's true? How do I know? First of all, how do I know that I'm not dreaming? Second, how do I know that there's not some evil genius manipulating my consciousness? Now, I'm not going to go into how Descartes tried to answer that. And because he said, I think, therefore I am, and I can't be confused about that, even if there is an evil genius, even if I'm dreaming. I don't need to go into that right now, but I do want you to know that Unger took from Descartes, again, this idea of a possibly undetectable deceiver who could manipulate people's ideas and consciousness. And so there's a key difference. There are a number of key differences, I suppose, between Descartes' view and that of Unger. I mean, for one thing, Descartes was what is called a methodological skeptic. In other words, he used skepticism to try to find out what, if anything, is absolutely certain. because he wanted to have a certain foundation for knowledge in philosophy and in science. See? Whereas Unger begins and ends in skepticism. But the key thing that you need to know is that Descartes believed in or at least he postulated for the sake of his argument and his theory of knowledge, this idea of a possibly undetectable deceiver. And that is certainly something that Unger was influenced by. Now, another question, why does Unger think that knowledge of the physical world is impossible? Well, remember this. Unger says that we cannot know anything about the physical world because to know something implies that we cannot be mistaken. Now, that's the key point. For Unger, knowledge requires that you can't be mistaken. If you could conceivably be mistaken about some proposition, then you can't know it, according to Unger. And of course, Unger thinks that is what most people believe, but they don't realize that if they really take that belief seriously, they'll find out there's precious little that they know, and they can't know anything about the physical world, even that rocks exist. Okay, so again, Unger thinks that we cannot know anything about the physical world because to know even that rocks exist would require that we know that we couldn't possibly be mistaken about their existence. And yet he says we can be mistaken about any belief we have concerning the physical world. Why? Because any belief we have concerning the physical world is something that we could be fooled about if there is an evil brain scientist, if there's an evil brain scientist manipulating our consciousness. Okay, why does Unger talk about an evil scientist? Unger talks about an evil scientist to introduce the possibility that we can always be mistaken about any beliefs based on sense experience. Remember, that's the whole idea. Unger wants to drive a wedge between what appears to be true when we talk about the physical world and what we can know is true. And what he wants to say is that ultimately we cannot know anything concerning the physical world. And the reason is that it is always possible that we're mistaken concerning anything related to the physical world. And that's because it's always possible that there is a deceptive brain scientist manipulating our consciousness. Okay, now when I say our consciousness, technically, Unger would say we can't even know whether other people exist because we could be deceived about that as well. Now, again, why does Unger talk about an evil scientist? Well, it's for what we've been talking about. He talks about an evil scientist to introduce the possibility that we can always be mistaken about any belief related to sense experience. And of course, he would argue that any belief concerning the physical world has to be based on sense experience, but any sense experience could in fact be an illusion, and yet it could be something that we don't realize is an illusion. And so he's going to argue that we cannot, strictly speaking, know anything concerning the physical world, even whether rocks exist. Now, how does Unger's view of knowledge differ from that of John Hospers? Well, interestingly, they really can agree a lot on some formal definition of knowledge. In other words, it seems that they both believe that knowledge is true belief based on sufficient evidence. But Unger doesn't think we ever have sufficient evidence for holding beliefs based on sense experience. Let's look at Hospers' analysis of propositional knowledge. Note that a proposition is something that can be true or false. You can express the same proposition using different language, and even, like, for example, you could say es regnet, it is raining in German, And you could say it is rating. In English, they could express the same proposition. Okay, so let's look at this again. Let's look at Hospers' analysis of propositional knowledge. When is it the case that we have propositional knowledge? According to Hospers, I know proposition P when P is true, and he calls that requirement the objective requirement of knowledge. That relates to the object of knowledge. Okay, so for me to know, for example, that I'm in, I don't know, let's say that I'm in Virginia Beach, Virginia. If I know that, then it has to be true that I'm in Virginia Beach, Virginia. I can't know that I'm in Virginia Beach, Virginia, if I'm in Richmond. Okay, so for you to know some proposition, it has to be true. Okay, and that's not controversial, by the way. And anyway, so Hospers calls that the objective requirement of knowledge. It relates to the object of knowledge. Okay, now, second, according to Hospers, I must believe what I know. Again, if I know that I'm in Virginia Beach, it has to be true that I'm in Virginia Beach. And again, that's an objective requirement of knowledge, but the object of knowledge must be true. Second, I need to believe it. I can't know that I'm in Virginia Beach if I believe I'm elsewhere, even if I'm in Virginia Beach. You understand that? I mean, if I'm in Virginia Beach, but I believe that I'm in Richmond, Virginia, then I can't know that I'm in Virginia Beach. Okay. And third, if I know something, some proposition, I must have adequate or sufficient evidence to believe that that thing is true. Okay, so if I know that I'm in Virginia Beach, it has to be true that I have adequate or sufficient evidence for believing it's true that I'm in Virginia Beach. And so, for example, by the way, the belief, the requirement that what I know I must believe, Hospers calls the subjective requirement. Now, why is that? Well, it's because that requirement relates to the knower's psychological state, or the subject. In other words, we're talking about saying that when you know that you're in Richmond, you must have a psychological state that is described by your believing that you're in Richmond. Okay, so this relates to the contents of your mind, if you like. And so, okay, so we've got the objective requirement of knowledge. What is known must be true. Again, that's Hospers. Hospers says, furthermore, when it comes to propositional knowledge, what is known must be believed. And the third requirement of propositional knowledge is that we must have adequate or sufficient evidence for believing that what is known is true. So, for example, suppose I scratch off a lottery ticket, and I say, I believe I'm going to win, and I win. It wouldn't follow that I knew that I was going to win that particular lottery game on that ticket. Why? Because it's just a coincidence, it's luck. Unless there's good reason for thinking I have sufficient evidence for believing I'm going to win, then I can't be said to have sufficient evidence. So just because I had a true belief, namely that that was going to be a winning ticket, it wouldn't follow that I knew it was going to be a winning ticket. Okay, so you need all three conditions to have propositional knowledge. Now, what I'm going to say to you is that's Hospers' position, but what I want to say to you is Unger can agree with that. But here's a key difference. Unger is going to say that we don't know, in the case of the physical world, in our beliefs about the physical world, we don't know that all those conditions are fulfilled. As a matter of fact, he's going to argue, we're talking about Unger, that when it comes to the physical world, we can never be in a position to say that we have sufficient evidence for believing something is true concerning the physical world. Okay, so what I'm saying is that Unger and Hospers can agree on a kind of a formal definition of knowledge as justified true belief. But what's going to happen is that Unger is going to say, well, we're one of the conditions for justified true belief is that we have sufficient evidence for our beliefs when it comes to knowledge, and that when it comes to the physical world, we can never be in that position to have sufficient evidence for believing that those beliefs are true. For believing, for example, that rocks exist. Now, obviously, Unger and Hospers are going to disagree about that, right? Because Unger is defending skepticism, Hospers is attacking it, and that's why his article is called A Critique of Skepticism. Hospers believes that we very often have knowledge of all sorts of things, including knowledge of the physical world, including the knowledge that rocks exist. Now, it says, what on the review sheet, what does Hospers mean by the objective and subjective requirements of knowledge? As I said before, the objective requirement of knowledge says that the object of knowledge must be true, and the subjective requirement of knowledge says that what is known must be believed by the knower. Now, does Hospers believe that we can know false propositions? No. Remember what I said. I said that according to Hospers, a key requirement of knowledge, of propositional knowledge, is that what is known has to be true. So again, you can't know that, let's say, again, that you're in Virginia Beach unless it's true that you're in Virginia Beach. Okay, now how does Hospers' strong sense of knowledge, how is that connected to the idea of refutability? Okay. Hospers distinguishes between knowledge in the strong sense and knowledge in the weak sense. That is a controversial distinction. Many philosophers do not accept that distinction. Okay? Now, let me say further. So I asked, how does the Hospers' strong sense of knowledge connected to the idea of refutability? To refute something is to falsify it or show that it's false. Okay, so then the question becomes, Hospers says, well, let me just answer it this way. Hospers says, I know a proposition in the strong sense when I'm entitled to believe it regardless of future experience, even when the future experience appears to contradict the belief. Now, Hospers actually gives us a number of examples, and he's really typically quoting from other philosophers. He gives an example of someone who appears to have an ink bottle in front of him or her, and the ink bottles, the person seems to see it clearly and distinctly. And yet, when the person tries to pick up the ink bottle, let's say the person's hand seems to go through it. Or let's say the person reaches to pick up the ink bottle, and then the person's outside under a tree, and there's no ink bottle around. Or let's say someone takes a picture of a desk and you think there's an ink bottle on it, but after the picture develops, it shows everything but the ink bottle. Okay. Well, according to Hospers, he thinks that if you seem very clearly to see an ink bottle at some given time, and then shortly thereafter the experience that seems to contradict that, you're still entitled to say you must have seen it. And I just disagree. I think it's a bad example. I think if there ever is knowledge in the strong sense, that is to say some belief, you're entitled to hold on to regardless of evidence that appears to contradict it in the future. That it's not going to be any belief concerning what's in your immediate physical environment. Now, I think rather it's going to be something like rocks exist or the physical world exists. And if you think about it, if you think there's a rock right in front of you, right, and you go to touch it, but all the evidence now counts against it, your hand seems to go through it. Let's say that your alarm clock, or what you think is your alarm clock, rings. You open your eyes and you're in bed, and things are even clearer than they were before. Then you could say, oh, I think I was mistaken. I don't think you're going to say, oh, I must have been right about the rock a moment ago. But in any event, so I think, but here's the key point. The key point is that Hospers distinguishes between knowledge in the strong sense and knowledge in the weak sense. And knowledge in the strong sense would relate to beliefs that people are entitled to accept as true, regardless of future evidence. That's how he defines it. So think about, again, he says, while you're looking at a bookcase in your office and you see books there, you can say, okay, the books are there, but let's suppose you go outside your office for, I don't know, 5 minutes, and then to the extent that you have knowledge of the books in your office, he would say that would be knowledge in the weak sense. Why? Because you could go back to your office and there could be no books there. Perhaps somebody threw them out of the window, or who knows? I mean, you think of the Three Stooges, right? The Three Stooges years and years ago used to have these skits in which they would be worried about bizarre goings on and ghosts, and then there would be some bookcase, and it was of course leaned up against a wall, and then the wall would turn around, and then there'd be another, the other side of the wall, and there'd be no bookcase. But anyway, so what he's saying is, well, while you're looking at it, yes, it makes sense to believe the bookcase. I agree with that, but I would disagree with that you're entitled to believe that it was there, even if all future evidence counts against it. But in any event, so that's what I want you to understand. For Hospers, if you have knowledge in the strong sense, that means you're entitled to believe something, even if future, possibly almost immediate future evidence, or what appears to be future evidence, contradicts that belief. That's what I want you to know. That's what Hospers means by knowledge in the strong sense. Most of our knowledge, by the way, is going to be knowledge in the weak sense. Okay. In other words, it may be stuff that's true, for which we have evidence, but it's stuff that at least theoretically we could be shown conclusively to be right or wrong about. And especially, the cases in which we could be wrong about are going to be cases of knowledge in the weak sense, and that's going to be most of our knowledge. Now, does Hospers believe in knowledge of the physical world? Sure he does. Remember, Hospers' article is a critique of skepticism. He's not a skeptic. It is the person who's skeptical about our knowledge of the physical world is, of course, Unger. Why does W.K. Clifford believe that believing on insufficient grounds is never justified? Okay. Now remember Clifford. Clifford was asking the question, when are we justified in having beliefs? Okay. And his answer is, we are justified in having beliefs when and only when we hold beliefs in direct proportion to the evidence. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, that means that if the evidence is strong and we have sufficient evidence, then we should believe. If the evidence is ambiguous, if the evidence could be read in different ways, interpreted in different ways, or if we just haven't really studied the matter, then we should suspend judgment and not have any definite belief. Okay, so, but here's the question. Why does Clifford believe that believing on insufficient evidence is never justified? Clifford believes that we are all part of a society and of interdependent people, and that not only our actions but our beliefs can affect other people. Now, why is that? That's because typically beliefs issue in action, if not immediately, then in the longer term. And so, for example, if someone's prejudiced against a whole group of people, that person will tend to discount evidence that is contradictory to that person's view of that group, and that person will go out of his or her way to recognize anything that confirms that person's prejudice. Okay, so so our beliefs affect the way we look at the world. If somebody's prejudiced, then that belief can affect the way that person treats other people, whether that person treats seriously as a job candidate who may be a member of a group that person doesn't like. Okay? And so here's the point. According to Clifford, to the extent that we believe on insufficient evidence, we are more likely to be mistaken in our beliefs. We're more likely to act in ways that can be harmful to others. We're more likely to fall victim to prejudice. We're more likely to believe superstition. We're more likely to be defrauded. And he says we're more likely to lower the intellectual standards of the community we're parts of. And so what he says is, because our beliefs can affect our actions, because our actions can affect other people, we should never regard our beliefs as purely personal and private, but also we should actually regard them as potentially social and public, and especially in their consequences. And so he believes that as members of a society and of the human race, we have a responsibility to minimize error and minimize intellectual error, which could cause us to act in ways that are harmful to other people. And he further thinks that to the extent we get used to believing things just because it's comfortable to believe those things, but not on the basis of sufficient evidence, we're weakening our ability even to discern the truth. And by weakening our ability to discern the truth, it'll be more and more difficult for us to discern the truth. And then other people we associate with may be less inclined to be careful about speaking the truth in front of us. So he thinks again that we have a moral and social responsibility to believe only according to the evidence and to minimize error. Okay. Now, does Clifford think that we should avoid believing entirely if we could ever possibly be mistaken? The direct and short answer to this is no. Clifford says that we should proportion the strength of our belief to the strength of the objective evidence. If, according to the best evidence, let's say there, and I give this example on our review sheet, there's an 80% chance of rain somewhere in the area, we should believe that it will probably rain, but it may not. If the evidence is weak, we should have a weaker tentative belief. If the evidence is uncertain or ambiguous, or if we haven't spent time examining the evidence, we should, according to Clifford, suspend judgment and have no definite belief one way or the other. Now, does William James think that we should always have sufficient evidence before believing? No. William James says that in matters of religion, and in many other matters as well, especially in matters in which the evidence for or against is indecisive, but in which a positive belief can possibly make a momentous difference in getting what we want, we may, he says, legitimately take a leap of faith. James would say that when it comes to scientific theories, or there's some other context too, is when we're having financial investments, people should base their beliefs quite directly on the evidence. But there are many exceptions. But for example, some beliefs are to some degree self-fulfilling prophecies. In other words, if we hold these beliefs, we're more likely to get, let's say, to get straight A's if we believe we can get straight A's, and if we're skeptical of that and we don't believe that. Or we're more likely to have a successful relationship if we believe that the other person's going to like us and we're going to get along with the other person. And we're more likely to succeed in business if we believe that we'll be successful than if we have a neutral or negative belief. So, to some degree, some of our beliefs can be self-fulfilling prophecies. Okay? And to some degree, we can get what we want, especially if it requires a lot of hard work over a long time, only if we first believe we're capable of getting what we want. Okay, so it pays normally to have positive expectations and to act accordingly. And James was one of the first people in modern intellectual history, really, and in psychology, to say that our beliefs and our attitudes will make a hugely important difference in the quality of our lives, the quality of our achievements. So again, James thought we can sometimes be justified in taking a leap of faith. Not always. Not always. Not when we're dealing with scientific theories. And if somebody walked up to you and said, I want you to take this pill, you'll feel better, and you have no idea who the person is or what the pill is, I can guarantee you James is not going to say take the pill. Right? Okay, So James is not going to say believe whatever you want whenever you want. He doesn't go that far, but he does say there are times when we can get what we want, or at least we'll be much more likely to get what we want, if only we first believe. If only we first believe, and especially in matters where the evidence is indecisive. And he's saying there are times when you're going to be successful only if you first believe. Okay, now why does James believe that Clifford's attitude toward evidence implies a rejection of the religious point of view? Well, here's an interesting point. Both James and Clifford, both, believe that religion requires a leap of faith. But here's a key difference. While Clifford unconditionally opposes leaps of faith in any area, not just religion, James thinks that sometimes a leap of faith is not only valuable, but it's indispensable to achieving certain goals that can transform one's life. Okay, so here's what I want to say. I want to say that James says that because Clifford always demands sufficient evidence, he is ruling out a religious commitment, which will typically require a leap of faith. So I want you to understand that. Now, here's a question. Whether valid deductive arguments must contain true conclusions. The short answer to this is no. Valid deductive arguments must only have conclusions that necessarily follow from the premises. Now, that doesn't mean the conclusions are going to be true. Okay, so let's look at it this way. Suppose I have the argument. We'll make it simple. All people are reptiles. President Trump is a person. Therefore, President Trump is a reptile. That's definitely a valid deductive argument. Now, why do I say that? Because the premises logically imply the conclusion. One would be contradicting oneself if one agreed with those premises while disagreeing with the conclusion. In other words, if someone says, yes, all people are reptiles, yes, President Trump is a person, but then disagreed that President Trump is a reptile, the person ultimately would be contradicting him or herself. So, valid deductive arguments are arguments in which the premises logically imply the conclusion. They're arguments in which it is self-contradictory to say yes to the premises while saying no to the conclusion. Now, then the question is, we've asked, does that mean that a valid deductive arguments must have true conclusions? The answer is no. The only time valid deductive arguments must have true conclusions, the only time, will be when all the premises are true. Valid deductive arguments are truth preserving. If all the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. Okay? Now, what does that tell you? That also tells you that if you have a valid deductive argument, in other words, if the premises logically imply the conclusion, but the conclusion is false, you know that at least one premise has to be false. Okay? So again, the short answer, whether valid deductive arguments must contain true conclusions, is no. Again, valid deductive arguments must only have conclusions that necessarily follow from premises. In a valid deductive argument, the premises, again, will logically imply the conclusion, but it's quite possible to obtain a false conclusion. In fact, as I've suggested, a valid deductive argument can contain a false conclusion only when at least one premise is false. Since valid deductive arguments have premises that logically imply the conclusion, they will have true conclusions when their premises are true. But they may have false conclusions when at least one premise is false. Okay? And I just gave you an example of a valid deductive argument with a false conclusion. President Trump's, it's all people are reptiles. President Trump is a person, and therefore President Trump is a reptile. Now, whether valid deductive arguments must contain true conclusions when all premises are true. Yes, valid deductive arguments are truth preserving. In a valid deductive argument, the conclusion necessarily follows from the premise. It's either a restatement of the premises or it's a logical implication. So if I say that there are 10 persons in this room, therefore there are at least 8, that's a logical implication of that premise, and that would be necessarily true if the premise is true. In any event, that's what I want you to know. A valid deductive argument must contain true conclusions when all the premises are true. Because valid deductive arguments have premises that logically imply the conclusions, a valid deductive argument with all true premises must contain true conclusions. Now here's another question: whether strong inductive arguments with all true premises must have true conclusions. The answer is no. Now, a deductive argument aims at logical certainty. It aims at what has to be true given that other things are accepted as true, right? If you say that it's either snowing or raining, it's not snowing, therefore it's raining. Conclusion necessarily follows from the premises, right? If you say that no Baptists are polar bears, and therefore no polar bears are Baptists, that conclusion necessarily follows from the premise. Okay, so we've said that deductive arguments aim at logical certainty. When they achieve it, we say they're valid. But inductive arguments aim at probability. You see, here's the idea. In an inductive argument, the premises are supposed to constitute evidence for thinking the conclusion is probably true or more likely true than not. Okay, so they aim at probability. But it is quite possible to have a strong inductive argument with all true premises and a false conclusion. Improbable things happen. Example, suppose I go to the same, let's say, fast food restaurant every day. Let's just say it's Wendy's. I go there every day, and I always order the same thing, iced tea. And I always like it. It's the exact same restaurant, same location, and I've done this for 1,000 days in a row. Okay. Now, it would make sense to say on the 1,001st day when I go there that I'll like the iced tea. And the conclusion is probable given the truth of the premises. That's a strong inductive argument. And we can assume that there could be a context in which the premises are true. It's a strong inductive argument for believing that I'll probably enjoy the tea when I drink it for the 101st time. But it's possible that I won't. It's possible that there's a new recipe. It's possible there's a new manager, or that the manager wants to save money and is diluting the tea more than usual. It's possible that somebody, as a practical joke, put hot sauce into the tea, or someone accidentally was bleeding into the tea, and I look at the tea and I see blood. And so I can imagine circumstances in which I wouldn't enjoy the tea even if I had enjoyed it previously for 1,000 times in a row. Okay, so a strong inductive argument has a conclusion that is probably true, but not necessarily true. Again, inductive arguments aim at probability, not logical certainty or logical necessity. Okay, now here's a question. What is epistemology? Well, it's a branch of philosophy. It's the branch of philosophy that involves knowledge. It involves investigating the nature of knowledge or the definition of knowledge, the scope of knowledge or the limits of knowledge, and the possible sources of knowledge. For example, whether knowledge requires sense experience, reason, intuition, faith, and so on, or whether those are possible means of knowledge. Okay, so again, epistemology is the branch of philosophy dealing with knowledge, and specifically the nature or definition of knowledge, the scope or limits of knowledge, and the possible sources of knowledge. How about metaphysics? Well, metaphysics is a branch of philosophy dealing with the ultimate nature of reality and existence. For example, it asks such questions as, what sorts of things ultimately exist? Is there a creator? Does free will exist? What is time? What are persons? Do persons require physical bodies? Does it make sense to think of persons existing without their bodies? Now, obviously, one would have to define all these terms. In other words, you'd have creator, free will, time, persons, and so on. But the point is that metaphysics deals with, again, what ultimately exists. What sorts of things are ultimately real? That's metaphysics. What is aesthetics? Aesthetics is the branch of philosophy dealing with the ultimate nature of art and beauty. What is art? Can anything qualify as art? Is art simply determined by the person who is claiming to create art? Is beauty simply and completely in the eyes of the beholder? So questions about what ultimately art is, what ultimately beauty is, those are questions for aesthetics. 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 Okay, so you need to know all of that to do well on the first test. And most of the testing we have will involve true, false, and multiple choice. Typically, what we have is 20 questions except for the final. The final exam is going to have 40 questions. But the other three exams, the other three tests, have 20. And typically, you'll get questions that'll be true, false, and multiple choice. But if you know everything on this review sheet, and I encourage you students to create flashcards for definitions, create flashcards to go over who believes what. And then I would encourage you regularly to study the flashcards, to shuffle them, to cover the questions in different orders. And flashcards are excellent because they require you to recall information, not simply recognize it. And people sometimes just read and reread over their notes, but they don't try to recall it. They don't try to teach it. They don't try to paraphrase the material. And then often the students don't do well on their tests. So I encourage you to create flashcards for technical terms, for who believes what, and I encourage you to regularly use them, to shuffle them. I encourage you to try to paraphrase what you're learning. I encourage you to try to get in conversations about it. And I think if you do all those things, you'll have a much better chance of getting a good grade on the test than if you didn't do those things. Well, that pretty much concludes the review for the first test in Philosophy 110P.